All right, good morning, folks. Thank you so much for joining us and welcome to this third plateau webinar on organizational resilience. We're so happy to see so many of you on the line today. Just want to go over a few housekeeping items before we kick it off. We've got 2 hours together this morning, and we'll be starting with a presentation from some of my fantastic colleagues, and of course we'll be leaving plenty of time for Q&A. If you've got any questions, either during the presentation or at the end, feel free to throw them in the Q&A function. If you've got technical difficulties, feel free to chat me, Carly Strauss. We are recording this session and we'll be sharing slides and a recording at the end. Once again, thank you so much for being here, and I want to hand it off to my colleague, Jonathan. Take it away.
Great, thank you, Carly. First off, happy Tuesday, everybody. Apologize for the date on the bottom. It is not April 3rd. I know time is going by exceptionally slowly, but we'll, in our effort to move rapid, are moving, living what we preach here as well. I'm really excited to have this session with all of you. Feel like a lot of what we've been doing in the intro webinar and in the first 2 sessions of this series have been building up to today, which is why we wanted more time blocked off for today. Before I get going, though, I want to introduce another one of our colleagues who's joining today. Rebecca Altman. Rebecca, do you mind doing a little intro of who you are and what you do here at Third Plateau?
Sure. It's so nice to be with you all today. I'm a senior director at Third Plateau. I manage and lead our leadership development and executive coaching practice. So working to partner with leaders and building up their capacity to lead and manage change.
Great. So you'll get to hear a lot more from Rebecca later today, and then a lot from Rebecca on Monday in the 4th session. Rebecca, thanks for joining us today, and glad to have you on the team here. Okay, so we have got a whole lot of great content for you today. We've got 2 full hours blocked. In the effort and knowing where everybody is mentally right now, we might not use the entire time, but wanted to block it all just in case, and make sure there's plenty of time for questions and answers towards the end, but certainly won't hold you longer than is needed on this. Want to remind everybody, we have a ton of resources up on our website. Just go to thirdplateau.com. You'll see the COVID-19 crisis response banner up at the top. Spoiler alert, it's where the giant red arrow is pointing you. Check it out. It's all of the recordings of the past webinars. It's the slides, the handouts, the templates. There's also a lot of other resources on there around how to work with remote teams if you're new to this, things around online convenings, a bunch of other resources that we found. So please, please, please visit the website there and take advantage of all of those resources that we've put out there. All right, so today's session is on organizational resilience, which is a real shift from where we've been. The first 2 sessions of this series were focused on how do you deal with the fact that you're in the middle of a crisis and how do you navigate through this. And we're now going to switch into recognizing there's other shocks that are going to keep happening, right? The COVID-19 crisis is still unfolding, and we now know it a little bit better. We can anticipate what's going to happen a lot better. And this session is going to help us think through, all right, what's actually coming down the pipe towards us? And what can we do to make sure that our organization and our team members and ourselves are as resilient as possible to be able to navigate it effectively? And so that we get out of this phase that we're in right now of playing catch up and actually get ahead of some of the things that we know we can expect so that we don't have to be so overwhelmed and underprepared for the next part of this crisis. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to Marie, who's going to help tee this up and get us going.
Thanks, Jonathan. Yeah, so I just wanted to start by calling back to the same slide we've mentioned in a couple of the webinars, talking about what's different during and after a large-scale crisis like COVID-19. And I wanted to just call out a couple of points that are going to be really relevant for the material we're working through today. So the first one I wanted to revisit was the complexity and rate of the cascading effects that are happening after a crisis mean it's increasingly difficult to plan very far in the future. So there's kind of a butterfly effect of a lot of different changes happening simultaneously throughout all the various systems that are involved in everything that we do as organizations and the context that we're operating in. So this is what makes looking towards the multiple future realities that we can kind of see, but we're not completely sure which is going to be the one we're operating in next week, next month, particularly important. The next one I wanted to call out was our brains operating differently when there's a perceived threat, and our decision-making and behaviors becoming erratic when we feel threatened. You might have heard preparedness is the best response. If you look up anything about disaster cycle management, you will see that it's definitely true. And this is part of why that is. We want to be making decisions about how we're going to respond and what we're going to do when a crisis event happens, ideally before the crisis event happens, when our brains are not really coming from that place of stress and feeling the pressure of the event that's happened. And then the last one I wanted to call out was what was previously the unexpected has become the expected, and now we can plan for it. So this is the more optimistic tone and the good news of what we're going to be talking about today compared to what we've been talking about in the last couple of weeks, which is how to kind of play catch up and respond to what's already happened. At this point, we know that large-scale shifts are going to happen. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when and how. So because we know that those are coming and we now have a lot of credible information, a lot of different people putting out opinions and forecasting and projections of what might be still to come in the next, weeks, months, however long this lasts, that means that we're now able to actually plan for that. We're actually able to take steps now to be prepared to respond when that happens and to minimize the impact that it has on us as organizations as well as the populations that we serve. So going back to disaster cycle management, I just wanted a quick recap that as well. As we've discussed in all the webinars so far, we're currently in the response phase to the COVID-19 crisis event. And ideally that cycle starts with mitigation and preparedness, where we're looking ahead and we can anticipate what's going to happen. That's obviously not the situation that we were in with this pandemic. But as I just mentioned, it is the situation we're in now for all of the other changes that are happening as a result of COVID-19. So that's what we're going to focus on today, is the mitigation and preparedness phases for all of these different aftershocks that are still unfolding. So we've been talking about doing all of this very, very quickly. And that's really important when you're looking at assessing needs and mobilizing a response. The good news is today we're finally going to be taking a breath. Once your response is underway, you have your feedback loops in place, and you're iterating on an effective response, you're done playing catch up, and we're going to turn to those mitigation and preparedness phases. So today we're going to talk about 4 different components of this. The first is doing mitigation or risk assessment. So looking to the potential events that might happen and estimating the risk associated with them. We're going to talk about mitigation planning and implementation. So once you've identified the likelihood of events happening, what can we do now in order to minimize the likelihood of them happening, if that's possible, or to minimize the impact that it'll have on us and the populations we serve. We're going to talk through contingency and preparedness planning. So looking at those events that we've identified we're at risk for, identifying now how is our organization going to respond when this event actually happens? What actions are we going to take? Who's going to take them? When? How? And then doing a preparedness plan to ensure that everything is in place, that contingency plan can be activated as soon as possible when that event occurs, if it occurs. And then the last thing we're going to talk about today is monitoring risks. So once we know the things that are at risk, we have a contingency plan, we need a way of monitoring how those are changing and triggering specific actions in those contingency plans. So before we get started, I just wanted to take a minute. As I said, we're going to take a breath. We're going to turn our attention to some topics around resilience and taking care of your team and yourself. These processes are very hard. We've been really hammering on the need to act quickly. I personally am used to being in these types of situations in a humanitarian response context where the people around me have all signed up for this. We all knew what we were getting into. We all knew what was likely to happen. And we were trained and prepared for how to respond. That's obviously not the situation that we're all in. None of us signed up for this. We didn't know this was coming. Very few of us were trained for how to deal with a situation like this, and definitely not for this specific situation. The second thing I wanted to call out is that this isn't a situation that just affects our organizations and the populations we serve. It affects all of us personally as well. We're not responding to a crisis that's happening somewhere else, to someone else's community. This is very real for all of us too. It's real for all of us on our team here at Third Plateau, everyone on this webinar, all of your teams. It's not just real in our work, this is very real for us on a personal level also. So that said, this is hard and it's scary, and a lot of preparedness and mitigation planning is asking us to plan for the worst case scenario, which is not something that is very exciting or pleasant to think about diving into. So we need to enter this with caution. If we stay in the worst case scenario mode all of the time, our brains aren't really processing positive emotions in the same way. We can get tunnel vision, lose sight of the big picture. So I promise you, we're only going to stay in this place temporarily, just long enough to make a plan and get to implementing it. We do really want to avoid getting stuck here. So before we jump in, I'm going to turn it over to Rebecca, and she's going to talk a little bit more about the resilience aspects of how you can go into this with a lot of intention to not get stuck in that worst case scenario place.
Wonderful. So just to start that off, I think what's so important about organizational resilience is that it actually starts inside of us with the resilience that each of us take into this process and this crisis moment that we're all in. So just take a moment. The slide asks a question: what are we all feeling and experiencing right now? And I think, you know, many of us are moving so quickly through our response that we probably haven't asked ourselves this question very much at all. So just take a moment to yourself to just check in with actually what your inner landscape looks like right now. What is the experience you're having personally in response to what's happening externally in your organizations, in your life right now, and just check in with that. And as we move into the next piece, I want to actually explain into the next slide on grief, to actually explain a little bit about what is happening. You might have just checked in and felt a range of different things, but it actually can be very helpful to kind of zoom out and look at a population level at what is actually happening in our inner worlds right now, collectively across the board. So there's definitely a very strong experience of grief. We're all feeling a lot of grief right now. This is happening personally for you, each of us, but it's also really important to recognize that this is happening for each of your team members, for each of your community members, the beneficiaries of your organization and of your program. So we need to do this work to process our grief individually. We also need to empathize with how much of this grief actually all of us are experiencing collectively. So there are a lot of different kinds of griefs, actually. You'd be surprised. There's grief around just how actually we're feeling this significant change that feels very, in a sense, permanent, even if it is temporary. There's grief around just sort of the loss of normalcy, right? Like the fear around what is to come and the general core pieces of our world, whether that's school or work or the economy, things that we sort of have taken for granted that are now up in the air with a great deal of uncertainty. And this is really important to note because this is actually collective grief, and putting words to that can be helpful in sort of in that check-in that I just described, putting words to what you're actually feeling inside. This is not grief happening in one isolated place. This is happening collectively at a really scaled up level across the globe. The piece here that's also important as we think about grief is to look at it not just as grief in the moment, but also grief that's really known as anticipatory grief. Grief about something that has not yet happened or that our brains actually predict might happen, right? The loss of someone that you love, the loss of people, the loss of community. These types of things actually really break our experience with safety. They actually violate our inner safety mechanisms that we have in our bodies and our brains. And this is a reality that we're all facing. So that's the first piece. Just notice what's happening inside and recognize that grief is happening in your world, but also in all of your direct reports, colleagues, community members as well. The next piece is around anxiety, right? Shocker, right? We all understand that this is a normal reaction to uncertainty, that this crisis around COVID-19 has created a very uncertain future. People are worried about their own health, the health of loved ones, and there are concerns, as I mentioned, around some of the main functions of our entire economy and world. So it's important to recognize that while this is normal, it's really important for you to both be kind to yourself, but also to recognize that, you know, for you to show up at your best, you also have to know and recognize that this anxiety is really penetrating everybody's psyche right now. So this is actually this week, the American Psychological Association conducted a poll that looked at that actually showed more than 1/3 of Americans are feeling that the COVID-19 crisis is seriously affecting their psychological health. And that's only those that it's seriously affecting. There are many people who this is minorly, moderately affecting our psychological health. Most of us are really good at recognizing the symptoms of anxiety that are very obvious, right? You know, your heart rate increases, your throat or your chest tightens. You might feel tension in your shoulders or your muscles. These are very obvious sort of symptoms of anxiety, but we're not very good at recognizing the many, many different other ways that that anxiety really fuels other problems. So for example, focus, you know, memory, sleep, the ability to communicate clearly and effectively with others. Our brains are designed to run away from the tiger that's chasing us, right? And when that happens, we put every single bit of focus on chasing, you know, running away from that tiger, that lion, whatever the scary animal is that's chasing us. That's how our brains are programmed, to focus entirely 100% on that escape. So what happens in a world where now we're both running away from the lion and trying to juggle keeping our organizations afloat, you know, redesigning our programs, running through this entire disaster response planning process that Marie and Jonathan have taken us through over the last several webinars. So it's very hard for us to both not focus entirely on the lion chasing us and also carry out all these other activities as well. So it's very normal for us to have a loss of focus, but it's important to recognize that anxiety is a really bad decision maker, right? It's a really bad decision maker. And so we need to recognize that this is a piece of how we operate, and it really fuels these other issues as well. Okay, the last piece I want to highlight on this slide is just how contagious anxiety is as an experience, right? We think that this is something we can contain to ourselves, but it's really not. If you're on a Zoom call with someone, a colleague, etc., it's one of the most contagious types of experiences that we have as leaders. So recognizing that this isn't something you can socially isolate, this is going to affect your teams, and it's important to sort of recognize that we can't make it go away. It's not black or white, but we can find a place sort of in the middle where anxiety is managed, where we work through it. So just the last piece on anxiety that we wanted to highlight is really to understand it. Like, all of us are analytical thinkers, right? We want to understand, why am I feeling the way I am feeling? How is this impacting our organizations and our ability to, as Marie described, like make, you know, worst case scenarios, map it out, make plans, like what is actually happening there? As an analytical thinker myself, I find this to be a really useful framework to recognize that there really are three core sort of ingredients that contribute to anxiety. There's unpredictability, when we don't have a clear sense of what may happen next. Check, that's going on right now. Lack of control, when we actually don't feel like we have direct control for managing issues appropriately. And then finally, threats to the things that we love, the people and the things that we love. And so this is a real thing. We're moving from just threat to possibility, right? That this could actually really directly impact the people around us, including ourselves. So as we move into the next piece, what we want to describe to you is just that this isn't I don't want us to all have fixed mindsets around this. I just described, you know, the reality of anxiety, the reality of grief, the reality of these hardships we're all feeling internally, and how significant those are in playing out and how we make decisions, how we're able to address really big challenges, how we're able to think with vision and creativity. The reality is that it's not a fixed mindset, that this really is, our mindset really is the greatest tool that we have. And while we are programmed to run away from the lion, we have a lot more control over our brains and over our mindset than we give ourselves credit for. So what I want to talk through in this slide is really, how do we do that? How do we sort of take the reins in all of this and manage that experience that we're feeling? So the first piece here, this is research. All of this came out of a study from Stanford, as well as some research about resilience from the Center for Creative Leadership. But the first piece around how do we actually build resilience internally as we work through grief and anxiety is to work to just accept the change, right? The resistance actually creates the suffering, right? And so if we're just to accept that this is a great deal of change, that things are constant, there's inevitable processes that are just happening, that's the first step, accept the change. The second piece is really around learning, like what, you know, there are many people who are extremely and disproportionately affected by what is happening right now. But across the board, there's no one who can take away our ability to learn and absorb what's happening to us and what is actually taking place in our internal and external worlds. So I think the process that, that Marie and Jonathan have led us through in these webinar series gives us the opportunity to focus on the learning. When we pivot our brains from the scarcity to actually what we can learn, there's a great deal of resilience that can come from that. The next piece, this comes out of the Stanford research, is to focus on the silver lining, literally to look for it. So while there are many defenses that are happening, we can actually, if we focus more on what might be positive and creating the conditions for us to see what those positive things are, that can help to actually change the chemical experience in our brain. The chemical cocktail surging through our brain can actually be shifted simply through the act of searching for that silver lining. Maintain a sense of calm, easier said than done, but like I said before, anxiety is contagious, period. So the more you can actually work to maintain that sense of calm internally, that will impact the people that you're connecting to, working with, and even developing these plans with, right? It's directly connected to that. Cultivating relationships, this is actually, like I said, with the silver lining piece, this actually changes our brain chemistry. When we go from the scarcity of what might be lost, of being defensive, of being closed to what is happening, and we move into actually how we can build relationships, empathize with others, connect with other people, ask really great questions that help us as leaders tune into the experience of our direct reports and our community members and our beneficiaries, things change in our brains. And so we can use this as a tool. If all of us are to spend more time focusing on relationships with our team members, with our communities, things change, things happen. And obviously we need to find balance. All of us need to be taking care of ourselves. We can't pour from an empty cup. So how do we fill our cup? Even if it's just, an inch or centimeter of filling our cup, what are little things you can do 5 minutes a day that can support you to be able to have that greater balance? And finally, we wanted to just elevate, recognizing that everybody is going through something. This is a collective experience, but it's also very individualized. And so as leaders, as you're going through this process and responding to the disaster and through the protocols that we've discussed, really looking at individuals, right? If you're leading a team or even managing others or even managing a program, what is happening? Like tuning into what is actually happening for others can help take you out of that spiral and actually support you to be there and be more creative and resilient in the plans that you're creating. The last thing is, if you are a leader, don't hide right now. This is not the time to be, actually, and we're all leaders, so this is not the time for any of us to hide. This is the time for us to be visible, to really show the team and that you're working with, the teams that you're leading, that you're there, that we may not have all the answers, but that we're working through it, and to really show that visibility. Okay, so we're gonna actually do something today, not just talk about the concepts, but practice this a little bit and offer you one way which might actually help, even in this moment, create a small sense of calm. So there are different ways to do that. There is focusing on, playing calming music, gratitude. These types of things are very much proven in science. I like to think of mindfulness exercises, which is actually what we're going to practice here in just a moment, as much less about, finding, your yogic center and more about actually how do we use the science of our brains to take the reins back, like I said before. Mindfulness practices where we tune into our breath, tune into our bodies, the somatic experience we're feeling, is not only an individual practice, but might actually show you that if you work on that inner side of yourself, if you work on yourself before you get into that meeting that where you're leading other people and making big decisions, you actually will be able to drive greater change. So less about sort of yoga and more about how do we use the science of our brains to actually tune into ourselves and be more, be better decision makers as we're moving into this. So what we're gonna actually do right now is practice this. This is just an example of a mindfulness practice. We'll share and post this with all of the resources. This can be found online, as many other types of these things can. And like I said, when we started this section of the webinar, we rarely take a moment, especially in these times, juggling family, kids, work, to actually just check in with ourselves. So we wanted to actually create space for that today, very directly. So no one's camera's on, right? You can just take a moment if you want to literally change locations right now, find a comfortable seated position. You can close your eyes if that's comfortable for you. And just take a moment, either sitting or lying down. Align your head, your neck, and your spine. If your legs are crossed, just uncross them and let your hands rest quietly in your lap or by your sides. And notice as your body settles, just bring your awareness to your breathing. And as I said before, if you feel comfortable doing so, sometimes closing your eyes can just release the stimulation around you. And notice the breath. Notice that it's coming in and out. Follow that breath with all of your awareness. Follow it in as you breathe in through your nose and follow it out. You're not trying to change it in any way. You're just breathing. Breathing in and breathing out. And as you breathe in, notice and feel the breath as it passes through your nostrils. And breathing out, just feel the breath as it leaves your nostrils. Just keep your awareness lightly and gently on your breath. And if and when the thoughts come in, because they always do, just acknowledge them as thoughts. Thoughts without judgment. And take a moment and just let them go. Like clouds drifting away or a boat floating through the water, just let the thoughts float away and bring your awareness back to your breath. Back to this present moment. And each time your attention moves away from the breath, distracted by a thought about something you have to remember or something you need to do, something worrying you, just notice the thought, acknowledge it, and then bring your awareness back to the breath and back to the present moment. As your breath comes in, let your full awareness be focused on it. And as it goes out, notice the familiar rhythm starting to form as you inhale in through your nose and exhale, just letting it all out through your mouth. We're just going to take a moment like this in silence, noticing the inhale and the exhale, coming back to your breath when the thoughts creep in. And as we bring this meditation, this mindfulness practice to a close, you can keep your eyes closed for just a little bit longer and take a moment to just notice what you're feeling. Notice your body, what's here now, and notice your mind. And as you slowly come back into the space you're in, the room you're in, become aware of your body in the chair or the seat you're in. And before we kind of re-enter reality in the world, I want you to just check in again as we did at the start of the webinar. What do you notice now as you come back to this space? Just think to yourself, what is actually different in you now? What is different in you now? And finally, what is accessible here now that maybe wasn't before we spent some time checking into our breath? So take another deep inhale and exhale. And as you do, you can open your eyes back up, kind of come back into the space. So thank you. The goal here was not just to relax, which is a great added perk of it. The purpose of this exercise is really to show you what is possible when we get out of that amygdala hijack, when our brain is in that fight or flight mode, when we turn that off through a very direct tool of checking in with our breath, checking in with our bodies, there's actually science behind how this changes our brain, how it allows us to access the prefrontal cortex, which allows us to connect with others, which allows us to be good decision makers, which allows us to think creatively and be resilient and think differently. So I encourage you to find whatever practice works. If this doesn't work for you, no problem. There are many other ways for you to actually get out of that amygdala hijack. And hopefully this set of exercises we've talked through can be an initial start for you as you continue in your response planning journey and use your mind as your greatest tool. So I'm going to turn it over to Marie.
Great. Thanks so much, Rebecca. Huge shout out to her and also the Moving Traditions team. Really excited for that webinar next week. One of our colleagues from Moving Traditions facilitated a similar exercise before a meeting on Friday, and it really just hammered home the importance of making sure we're also doing our due diligence, taking care of all of you before we jump into this difficult material, and giving you the tools to be doing that with your team as well, because as we said, this stuff is really, really tough to talk through. So now that we've taken a second to mentally prepare ourselves, we can go ahead and start talking about mitigation and preparedness planning and monitoring your risk. And we talked about what causes anxiety, unpredictability, and lack of control being two of those three ingredients. So these steps are really about helping your organization and your team counter that sense of unpredictability and lack of control that is contributing to the anxiety you're all feeling right now. So these steps are really about looking ahead and identifying what things are in your control and doing what you can do about those right now. So the first step is similar to the other things that we've talked through. It's convening your crisis team. The advice we're giving is going to sound very familiar for those of you who have been on previous webinars. It's going to be essentially identical to the advice we put together for response planning. And if you can have the exact same team, that's completely fine. The continuity will be beneficial. As a refresher, you want no fewer than 2, probably no more than 6 people. You must have key decision makers in the room. A lot of this is going to be about deciding what steps you're going to take very decisively in real time. So you want to make sure you have buy-in from senior leadership and anyone on your team who needs to be bought into those decisions and those actions. People who can make this their top priority and be available to really get through this process so that you have it all in place before the next event that you need to be prepared for occurs. Ideally, having representation from different vantage points and functions within your organization, thinking about the communities you serve, making sure that that is reflected in this group as well. It can also be really helpful to have that continuity of someone who is involved in your rapid needs assessment as well, to continue to be that kind of voice of the data, voice of the user, making sure that this is all grounded in the information that you've collected. So we're going to start talking about risk assessment, which is the first of the components we talked about going through this process. So often people think about mitigation and preparedness planning as a general exercise, but it's important before we start to remember that these need to be plans for specific events. For example, having a general natural disaster plan is pointless if you prepare for a flood the same way you prepare for an earthquake, or if you respond to them the same way, it's going to be very, very ineffective. So risk assessment is the process by which you will identify which specific events pose enough risk that you need to take action to mitigate and prepare for them. So this first step, this is kind of the bad news part. This is the really uncomfortable and really difficult thing. You need to identify all of the potential events that you foresee right now that would be likely to impact your organization and or the population you serve in some way relevant to your work. So you'll need to think of risks to both your organization, that sort of internal facing component, as well as the populations you serve, that kind of external facing component. So this is sort of based in the idea that we know this isn't over yet, as much as we all wish it was. There are more things that are going to happen, and this step is about figuring out what those might be. So step 1 is going through and just identifying all the possible events. We can go to the next slide here. So before you start assessing how likely they are to happen or the level of associated risk, you just want to get through a brainstorm of exactly what all of those events might be. So this should be exhaustive. You should be writing down everything you can think of, and then after that, you'll go to the step of prioritizing. So to get everyone started, there's a list of possible COVID-19 related events that should likely be on everyone's internal facing list that you should be thinking about how you can be prepared for. Caveat again, none of these are very pleasant to think about. There's the likelihood of the extension of remote work requirements, extension of travel bans that might affect your work, assets going unused for an extended period of time, for example, rented office space, vehicles, other types of equipment. There's a possibility that someone on your team becomes sick or that they get very, very seriously ill. There's a possibility of that happening for someone in their family or a close partner. Reduction in donor or other financial support related to your revenue model, canceled contracts or pledges, internet outages or unreliability. These are all things that are possible that could happen, that should probably be on your list regardless of your organization and what you do, that you want to be able to mitigate and prepare for. When thinking about events on the external facing side, there will probably be a lot of overlap with the events that you identified that would be likely to have internal facing impacts. But there are probably a lot of events that wouldn't necessarily affect your organization that would affect the populations that you serve. So that list is going to look very different depending on the type of population you serve, the type of work that you do, whether you're serving organizations or individuals, and the different representations and experiences of users within those groups. It would be really helpful as you're doing this step to refer back to that handout we talked about in the Rapid Needs Assessment webinar, and we'll also put that in the materials online, on defining the populations you serve and privilege and vulnerability factors. This can really help to guide some of your thinking through the types of exposures that different groups that you serve might be having, and how future events could possibly impact them. It can also be helpful to have someone or a group of people on your team do some quick web research in advance to make sure that the list you're coming up with is well informed and using all the information that exists out there right now about what might be to come, and there's a lot of it. We've compiled a handful of useful resources. There's situation reports from Johns Hopkins on what's happening with COVID-19. There's information from the CDC. There's the New York Times Coronavirus Outbreak News Center and several other publications who have made a lot of their COVID-19 related content free without a paywall during this time. There's news from Council on Foundations and other sort of philanthropy specific resources. And then also economic updates. Deloitte Insights Weekly has a weekly global economic update. So these are the types of things that will be really helpful to just do a quick scan and see what's coming up, to make sure that you're utilizing all of this legwork that other people have done on your behalf to think about what might be happening next.
We'll include links to all of the resources Marie just mentioned. We'll include as links on what we upload to the website afterwards as well.
Absolutely. Yeah, and you'll also want to search relevant resources related to the topics that are aligned to your organization's vision and mission, specifically what you are doing. And also check any local publications for the geographic areas that you serve, if that's relevant, just to make sure that you're capturing all of these different sources. One thing I want to note when you're brainstorming these events is that you may need to list the same type of event at different scales if you would prepare for or respond to it differently. For example, how you would prepare for and respond to a member of your staff getting mildly ill might be very different than how you would respond to someone needing to be hospitalized. How you prepare for and respond to a slight reduction in donations is going to be really different than if you experience something so substantial that it means you no longer have the resources to meet your basic operating budget. So if different scales of the same event would require you to prepare and respond differently, those should be listed out separately in this brainstorming process. So a quick and hopefully more painless way of doing this is to do a basic affinity mapping exercise, which we talked through in a couple of the other webinars, where you're just going to brainstorm and then look for like and group them into themes. And this will hopefully minimize the amount of time you have to actually be talking about these difficult topics with each other, and hopefully get through this step very quickly. So on the next slide, we're going to have a resource that we're posting online, which is similar to what we've developed for other steps in these webinars, of where you can just go through that brainstorming process and affinity map with your team. So once you've listed all the possible events that might happen, the next step is to assess the level of risk that's associated with each of those individual events. At a high level, risk is roughly estimated as the likelihood that event is going to actually happen, the potential impact it would have if it occurred, and then how exposed and vulnerable you actually are to that threat. So we've tried to make this easier by putting together a template that we're going to post with the resources that'll help you do this. So once you've listed all those events, one by one, you're going to complete that table for the rest of each row. So first, you can see that purple box there is estimating the likelihood that this event is actually going to happen. You should do some basic web research just to get some external insights on this as much as possible. We've mentioned it a few times, our brains aren't working entirely in our most high functional way right now, so calibrating this with some other takes will be very helpful. So when you have the event, you can just search for that online, see what comes up, see what experts and other people are saying about it. Are other people worried about this? Is it on their radar? This isn't an exact science, and the information you'll have to go off of will very likely require you to do some speculation. So we've kept this very simple with a scale of low, moderate, or high likelihood. Once you've determined how likely you think this event is to happen, then you'll turn to estimating the potential impacts. And there's two components of this: thinking about the impact that event might have on your organization internally for your team, your operations, your funding, all those various components that Jonathan talked about in the internal facing rapid needs assessment. And then the second part is thinking about the impact it might have on the populations you serve. This should be informed by what you already know from the rapid needs assessment, as well as obviously good old-fashioned critical thinking. So for estimating potential impacts on your organization, in our template here, we've kind of referred back to those categories we talked about in the rapid needs assessment, but to keep things simple so you're not having to assess 10 areas of possible impact, we've sort of grouped them into 4 buckets. The first one is how might it impact our team and leadership. This includes staff safety and well-being, as well as your leadership's availability to focus on the crisis and how they're able to lead. The second bucket is how it might impact what you do. So that's looking towards your strategy and programming. Might this make some strategies and tactics you use no longer possible, less effective, as well as on your organizational culture? How might this event put a strain on your values? How might it affect your ability to have your team working together effectively? The third bucket here is how might it affect how you do those things that you do? And this is where all of that sort of internal, those pieces come together. Your staffing and volunteers, if this event happened, might it lead to areas where you're understaffed or where there are redundancies and some staff are no longer able to do their primary job functions? Logistics and operations, might it impact your communication systems, the information systems you have in place, physical assets? And then the fourth bucket here is how might it impact how you fund your work? How might it impact various revenue streams and sources? Would it present any new challenges to paying staff or sustaining your current operations? Might it affect how your funders are thinking about your work and what they're able to fund? Might it impact their ability to deliver on pledges or committed funding? And just to know, we're going to talk through some specific examples at the webinar. So right now I'm just going to overview what's in the template, and then Jonathan will take us through some actual examples of how to complete it. So moving to the next slide here, you can see that also if you go further down this template, then you're going to do the same exercise for the populations that you serve. And we've left this sort of open for you to decide what categories of impact you want to assess. And that should be relevant to your organizational mission and the things that are actually within the scope of your work to be addressing for the populations you serve. So we've left 3 spaces for impact categories in the template. You don't have to use 3. You can add more than 3, and then you'll just need to adjust that formula that we've built in if you do change the number of categories here. But for example, going back to the soup kitchen that we've been running with throughout these webinars and that Jonathan is going to continue with in his examples, thinking of the clients that come to the soup kitchen for meals as the population being served, we've identified potential impact categories of their physical health, safety, and well-being. The second category being hunger and food security, how might it impact that? And the last one, livelihoods and their ability to meet other non-food basic needs. And then at the end of this template here, you'll see that we've built in to automatically calculate a score on risk from 0 to 100 for each event. So if you fill out those, the likelihood, the impact, and then the vulnerability of each population to that, it'll automatically populate a score that should help you start to prioritize objectively which things are actually highest risk for our organization right now. So once you've assessed the risk, then you're ready to move into the other stages of this process, mitigation planning and preparedness planning. And first, we're going to talk about mitigation. So I really wish that we could tell you that you could prevent every single event you brainstorm from happening. But unfortunately, we all know that simply isn't the case. In all of this, there are a lot of things that are going to be beyond our control. However, mitigation planning is about identifying what is in your control. We can say with complete confidence that for every event on this list that you brainstorm, there will be something that is in your control to either reduce the likelihood or reduce the impact that it may have on your organization or the people you serve. So mitigation planning focuses on identifying specific actions that you can take right now to proactively minimize the likelihood or scale of that event, as well as the impact. This is a plan you're going to develop and implement right now to get out ahead of the next crisis event or aftershock from COVID-19. So we're going to think about this in three sort of key questions. What actions, if any, could you take to reduce the likelihood of it occurring? What actions could you take to reduce the impact on your organization? And what actions could you take to reduce the impact on the population you serve? So we've also developed, this is the second sheet on that template, which will automatically feed in from the risks you identified and ranked in the first tab. So you want to start with your high risk events and work down the list. There might be a threshold where you decide the risk is low enough from that assessment you did in the first phase that you don't actually feel like you need to create a mitigation plan for it. We're not going to set that threshold. That should really be something you decide with your team of what's the cutoff of things that are likely enough to happen and posing a big enough risk for us, so that you're not doing this for 100 possible things that might happen, but really focusing on the ones that are most likely to happen and most likely to impact your organization and the population you serve. So whereas your risk assessment was all-encompassing and very broad, thinking about everything that might happen, these mitigation measures you're going to develop should be specific to each event. How you reduce the likelihood and impact of a funder pulling support will be different from how you reduce the likelihood and impact of a team member getting sick. So you're looking at each individual event and thinking about how you can mitigate for that specific event. It's also important to be as specific as possible and exhaustive in thinking about what you can do now. So as you can see with the template we've developed here, this should look a lot like a work plan. For each task, there's something you can do, and there's a person responsible, a deadline for when that should happen by. So Jonathan will walk us through what this looks like in practice a little bit more. But once you have your mitigation plan done, it's not enough to just say, okay, like we filled out the spreadsheet, it's all there, it's good to go. You need to actually implement this now. This is something that you want to do ahead of when that event happens. Otherwise, it's not going to be very helpful for you. So then I'm going to move to the third tab of this sheet, which is preparedness planning. So you've identified the events that are posing risk for your organization. You've thought about what you can do now to minimize the likelihood and or impact of those events. And now you need to think about, what am I actually going to do if that event happens? What can I put together and plan for now so that when I'm responding to that crisis event, it's coming from a place of, okay, I thought about this, I planned for this, everything's in place, instead of catch up and being caught off guard like we all were with COVID-19. So this involves two sort of key components. And the first is contingency planning. A contingency plan is preparation for how you're going to respond if that event occurs. What will you do when it happens? Who's going to do it? When are they going to do it? How? Using what resources? This is a plan you're going to create now, but would implement in the future, or hopefully, ideally, not at all, because we're hoping none of those events come to pass. However, it doesn't quite end at developing that contingency plan. It's likely that the things that are in that contingency plan would require actions to be taken, and you don't want to be trying to mobilize all of that when the crisis occurs. So the preparedness plan component is looking at the actions you've said you're going to take in real time if that event happens. What are the steps you can take and need to take now to make sure that everything is in place and teed up, ready to be deployed if that contingency plan needs to be activated? This is a plan that you are also going to implement now. And I'm just going to quick walk through the template here before talking about risk monitoring and then going through some real examples. Same as your mitigation plan, these contingency plans are specific to each event that you've identified as being of high risk. Again, Same as your mitigation planning, it's important to be as specific as possible to minimize and ideally eliminate any confusion about what needs to happen if that crisis event hits. It should be very clear to people from this exactly what they need to do and when, so that you're not having to coordinate and get all that out in real time. People are just able to get to it and implement right away. So for each specific contingency action, there are those preparedness steps you need to take in order to be able to implement the contingency plan if and when the time comes. So for example, if you're going to reach out to key stakeholders or authorities when this event happens, do you have that list and contact information ready? If you're planning to scale up your distribution, do you have stocks ready or a supply chain that you can rapidly activate? If you're planning to do a specific type of funding appeal, do you have that language and a distribution list ready to go? So looking at the actions you want to take, what do you need to do now to make sure you're ready to take them? So this step is focused on doing as much as you can now, so you're not playing catch up during the crisis. Again, it's important to be specific and exhaustive in thinking about what you can do now. This looks a lot like a work plan. And same as your mitigation plan, it's not enough to just make it. You need to implement it right now so that it's ready ahead of the next crisis event. And the last thing I'm going to talk about before we start going through examples is risk monitoring. So as we discussed in the Rapid Needs Assessment webinar, as much as your current understanding of the situation is likely out of context, this will continue to be the case as long as this crisis is still evolving. So there's two components to this. One is putting a rapid information system in place to continuously update that internal and external rapid needs assessment as long as this crisis is still dynamic. And this should be aligned to the volatility and how quickly things are changing. So while you're at the early stages, this might be happening very frequently. It could be every week, it could be every month. And then as things begin to sort of stabilize and become more consistent, you can reduce that frequency. But you should be making those decisions in real time because it's hard to project and predict how everything is going to unfold and when things are actually going to even out to the extent that this no longer feels necessary to be doing at a higher frequency. And then the second part is for each risk that came out of that planning, risk assessment, mitigation, and preparedness planning process, you need to actually have a way of establishing a baseline. What's the situation now? Monitoring whether that risk is increasing or changing in any way, and setting a threshold that if passed is going to actually trigger those actions in your contingency plan. So you then need to ensure that you have a system in place and that someone is responsible for monitoring that data or developments in that risk area, and that they can update your crisis management team regularly on it. Your contingency plan is far less useful and much more difficult to manage if you don't have those specific triggers for when you know that you've reached a point that you need to actually activate the actions you've prepared to take. And we have a template for this as well. You can see it's sort of sandwiched between the contingency plan and preparedness planning. What information are you going to need to trigger those actions? And then how are you actually going to go about getting that information system in place? So I just want to talk a bit about communicating and sharing these plans and then continuously updating it before we turn to some more specific examples and this becomes a little bit clearer. So communicating and sharing your plans, this might seem very obvious, but first step is, of course, make sure everyone who's responsible for something in your plan knows about it and that they know when they're supposed to do it and are able to get to work. And then I want to call back to some points we talked about in response planning as well, because it's very relevant here. You want to be transparent. You want to be sharing this internally and externally with anyone who needs to be aware of what you're currently doing, what you're planning to do in the future. One caveat I want to put here is to be wary of creating panic. If there are certain actions that you have planned for that might cause more uncertainty or more anxiety, just be careful and intentional thinking about who actually really needs to see what. And then to also coordinate. As we've talked about before, resources are limited, needs are high, cooperation and coordination is essential, and normal sort of rules of engagement don't apply. You should be over-coordinating right now. This is important too when it comes to mitigation and preparedness planning. That's going to help proactively streamline coordination if that crisis event comes to pass that you are planning for. This is going to help avoid duplication and ensure full coverage with other partners, other people covering similar areas in your issue space. and avoid leaving people out when that could really be the difference between people making it through this crisis and not. And then I just want to talk a little bit about implementing and updating your risk assessment and plans. So as soon as you're done with your planning, the first thing you need to do is get to implementing your mitigation and preparedness plan. Neither of these are going to help you if they just stay plans. You need to actually have implemented them before the next crisis event happens in order to be able to benefit from that process. However, you should be convening your crisis team regularly as this is unfolding for two reasons. Risk isn't static. The crisis is dynamic, and so are your risks. As the context is changing and as you're taking actions to mitigate and prepare for these events, how vulnerable you are to each of those risk events you identified is going to keep changing. So you need to be continuously reassessing and revisiting that risk assessment to figure out what is the sort of greatest threat right now that you need to really have front of mind. So your crisis team should also be meeting at a frequency that's aligned to how complex and volatile the crisis is. Similar to with your continuous rapid needs assessment that you're updating, you should start with a pretty frequent basis and then scale back as that feels like it's the right thing to do for you and your team. So just to recap on our organizational resilience steps that we've talked through, the first is risk assessment, identifying possible events, assess how likely they are to happen, the impact they would have, and how vulnerable or exposed you are to them right now. With that, you're going to do event-specific mitigation planning and implementation, what actions you can take now to reduce the likelihood of that event happening if you can, and the impact of event, which you most definitely can. And then doing a contingency and preparedness plan. What's your plan for how to respond if the event happens, and what can you do now to be ready? I want to reemphasize that this is the sort of really positive bookend to the catch up and the sort of scary place that we've been in the previous webinars. This is about finding the things that are in our control, and it's about diving into thinking about what seems uncertain now that we can make a little bit more certainty around, and what can we do to take a little bit more control over what's going to happen next for us. So now I'm going to turn it over to Jonathan to walk us through some really specific examples that should hopefully make this process feel a little bit clearer.
Yeah, thank you, Maria. It's really, really helpful. So I'm guessing the majority of you are like, some of this is making total sense. Some of this is like, man, maybe you get it. And some of it feels very amorphous and hard to wrap your head around right now. And so I do want to get into a very specific example and actually walk you through a version of that same template that we created, just sort of thinking through what a soup kitchen would want to maybe go through. Before I get into it, I also want to just highlight that, like, we're here to support you if you need help on any of these things. Our goal in all of this is to get you the tools so that you can do all of this yourself, and that you and your team are empowered to go run with this and make this work. But please know that we're here. Just being overwhelmed by it doesn't mean you shouldn't be doing it. So if you need help facilitating any of these pieces, the risk analysis, the mitigation or preparedness planning, or developing the risk monitoring system, please just reach out to us and let us know. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing on this slide and open up an Excel sheet, and we can keep moving. Great. Okay, so this is, I built this into Excel here and not into the Google Sheet, but we will upload all of this to the Google Sheet so you have all of this in one place later. But this is thinking through the mitigation and preparedness planning for a soup kitchen. I'm zoomed out a ton right now. I don't expect you to be able to read all of this. I just want to show you, like, this is a pretty in-depth tool that we've tried to build for you. So I'm just going to scroll to the right here, and you can see that each row on this is another risk that we're thinking through, and different things that we want to, different questions we want to ask, and different things we want to assess. And as Marie was showing you, there's 3 different tabs here at the bottom of risk assessment, mitigation planning, and preparedness planning that all build off one another. Okay, so I'm going to zoom in here so we can get a sense of what are some of the risks that we are thinking about for our soup kitchen. So there were 3 risks that we thought of. And again, just trying to do a scrappy, quick example of this so you get a sense of it. One is that an infected individual comes into our soup kitchen and it becomes a high spread environment, right? It's a pretty, very realistic risk, but if I'm still operating an actual on-site program, there is a good chance that somebody is going to come in who is sick, and it's going to then all of a sudden start to spread among other people that are coming in, my volunteers, my staff, anyone else who might be in the area. The second risk here, again, is that we have to cancel our annual gala. It's a huge fundraising event we had planned in July. It's responsible for 30% of our fundraising, but because of local restrictions on gathering and shelter in place, we're going to have to cancel it. Right? That's another risk that I think is a reasonable risk for me to start anticipating and try to get out in front of. The third one I have here is that local gathering restrictions increase, and we're told we're actually even no longer allowed to run our program on site, even though it's an essential service. So something there actually needs to change. These are three really different risks. They're all tied to the same COVID-19 crisis, but these are very specific instances and very specific events that could come to be that I need to be ready to respond to, and ideally even get out in front of and be prepared, mitigate and prepare those risks. So let's kind of talk about these and run across the entire column so you get a sense of what types of information to be included. And again, we're going to upload all of this to the Google Sheet, or we'll just upload the Excel sheet itself to the to templates for you to get to use. So, okay, so an infected individual comes into our soup kitchen, becomes a high spread environment. What's the likelihood that happens? I put it as a moderate, right? It's not, I don't think people that are feeling really sick are necessarily going to come in. I assume they'll probably send somebody else if they know, but you don't know who's sick. You don't, you're contagious before you've got symptoms. I put this as sort of a moderate risk. And then here are the four buckets that, that Marie was referring to that I want to think about. Again, this is the impact on my organization. Again, thinking about low, moderate, or high. So on my team and my leadership, if somebody comes in who's sick, what is actually the risk there to my team, or what's the impact? Well, here's a chance to actually say, in the first column here in column C, what is that risk, 1, 2, or 3? And some descriptor, so that if other people are working on it, they understand the assumptions I'm making or the thinking behind my scoring. So for here, I'm saying, well, this would affect the safety of our staff that work on location in the soup kitchen and create a high stress situation that would need to be managed externally by our leadership team, right? There's the people are going to come in. Now all of a sudden my team is nervous about getting sick. There's a higher risk they're going to get sick. I have to manage that in a pretty significant way. On what we do, right? If this actually happens, my programming is going to have to change, right? We no longer are able to operate the way that we used to operate. So I put this as a 3. On how we do it, right? I also put this as another 3. All of a sudden my volunteers maybe aren't going to want to come in. I need to think through like what's going on, but I'm not able to operate my program the same way that I was. Everything now is getting disrupted. On how we fund it, I think it's a relatively low impact. I'm not saying funding is not a major thing to have on my radar for COVID-19, but for this specific event, am I really in any different of a financial situation? I think maybe it starts to check some of the confidence of some funders. Maybe it decreases how many meals we can serve, and maybe that's going to impact our numbers, which maybe make a funder less attracted to us. But overall, it's a relatively low risk on this. I'm going to keep moving to the right, but want to just show you how different some of these other pieces are. So let's look at the funding one, which I know is top of mind for many people on this webinar and listening to the recordings and on the website and on YouTube. Let's assume that I now have to cancel my gala, right? I'm no longer able to bring a whole group of people together to have a moderately okay meal and charge people a lot of money, and people are donating a whole lot, and we have a silent auction and a live auction, and it's super fun and exciting, and it's responsible for 30% of my fundraising. But because of the situation, I'm no longer able to hold that event. Okay, the likelihood of this happening, pretty high, right? At this point, most events in June everything in April is canceled. Everything in May is pretty much canceled. Some stuff in June is still sort of holding on, but mostly getting canceled at this point. July is kind of in that space of it's unlikely that we're going to be able to hold large events in July. All right, so I'm going to think this is a high likelihood event. In terms of the impact on my team and my leadership, I'm going to put this at a 3. And again, just in terms of staff safety and well-being, I know that my staff's aware of where our funding comes from. If we have to lose that gala, everyone's aware of what that means to our bottom line. Staff is going to start thinking significantly more about their own job security or insecurity. It's going to damage productivity. It's going to damage morale on my team. It's also the most fun event we get to do, and all of a sudden now we don't get to celebrate it. In terms of what we do, right? I put this also as a risk, the risk here is high. If we don't make this money, we're not going to be able to operate our model, right? We're not going to be able to cover the costs we need to actually do what we do. Our strategy and our approach to our current model, something there is going to have to move. On how we do it, I put this at a moderate risk, right? Maybe we're not going to be able to keep up with some software subscriptions. Volunteer management maybe is going to get a little bit harder with less money if it's going to impact sort of who we can have on staff or what programs we can run. People are going to be disappointed. It's just going to, like, the systems themselves are going to start to get stressed a little bit. It's a 2. It's not as high as, what I expect to happen on leadership, or in the next category, what I expect to be happening on how we fund it, which I'd put it a 3 and put it a 4 if our scale went that high. It's going to be a direct hit to us. So you can start to see there's a little, it's some nuance between how you handle different risks on this. The point of this is it's a blunt instrument. It's a 1, 2, or a 3. Just get the number you think is close enough and keep moving through it. So I'm going to keep scrolling to the right here so you can see what comes next. So the next piece in that risk assessment is how vulnerable my organization is if this event happens. So, okay, if an infected individual comes in, my vulnerability, exceptionally high, right? It is going to directly impact everything that we are doing. Without some type of screening or barriers to participation, it's going to make this really hard for people to participate. Similarly, on my gala, we're highly dependent on this event fundraising. If we don't get it, it's going to make us. It's going to have a very direct impact on our budget, and we are so dependent on that gala to make all of this work. It's just the vulnerability is exceptionally high. So this column M, automatically calculates. I don't have to do anything with it. It's taking the numbers I put in there and saying, this is your risk score on it. So you can start to see among these 3 risks we put in, I've got a score of 97, I've got a score of, and I've got 2 scores of 85.5. So as I'm thinking through where my highest priorities are, just for organizational risk, the funding is my biggest risk to my organization. The other 2 are number 2 on that list. But that's not the end of it. We also want to think about the impact to the population, which is where we go a little bit further to the right here. So this is the piece that is entirely customized to the type of industry or type of work that you do. So we identified 3 basic categories of things that I think are, that I'm thinking about for my population. 1 is their physical safety, health, and well-being. 2 is hunger and food security. And 3 is their livelihoods and ability to meet other non-food basic needs. Those are the 3 things that I'm thinking about for the population I serve through my soup kitchen. So same thing. For each one of these, I want to put down what is my risk score and some descriptor of why I'm giving it that score so that I can make this a more collaborative tool with the rest of my team, and ideally with my crisis response team. So you can see on the physical safety and health and well-being, if somebody comes into my soup kitchen sick, that's going to be, it's an automatic 3, right? People are now immediately going to be, the potential impact on them is exceptionally high, right? I do not want a high-risk population being additionally exposed to COVID-19. That potential is exceptionally high in my population. Meanwhile, the funding, maybe a little bit less so, right? Me, as an organization getting less funding, eventually that might hit the population if I have to shrink my services. But for the most part, it's like the basic things that they're still going to feel. The physical safety and well-being, maybe my security guard I can't have on staff as long as I wanted to, or have working as many hours. So maybe there's a little bit of a risk there. Maybe I have fewer staff on hand, so I can't help monitor the actual site as well as I used to. So it's a moderate risk. In terms of hunger and food security, right? If somebody comes into my soup kitchen and they're sick, it probably doesn't directly impact the food security, but it maybe limits my ability to address future food security needs. Right? All of a sudden, my site is now contaminated. People are nervous about outbreaks. I'm probably less equipped to actually go help them and meet their needs on food security. And this is one other piece I was getting out of. All of my food is donated, or I get exceptionally cheap. My budget going down probably is not going to change the amount of food I'm getting or what I can do. how I do it maybe needs to change, but it's not going to immediately impact the hunger or food security of my population. Again, it's perfectly fine if you disagree with my assessments on this. This is why we want you to do it with a team, to get other people's input and going, hey, that's a really lousy assumption. What about X, Y, or Z? And having representation in that committee that looks like we're experiencing things similar to what your population experiences, we'll be able to assess these risks in a really different way than maybe senior executives are thinking about them. And then finally, around livelihood and ability to meet needs, I put these both at a 3. For the people involved, if somebody becomes sick, it's going to seriously impact what they can do. On the funding side, if I have fewer social workers to provide social emotional support, mental health support, I'm not going to be able to help the people coming into my soup kitchen with all the other things I want to do as part of my theory of change with them. Vulnerability. How vulnerable is my population to each specific event if they happen right now? So obviously, this is somebody being sick is going to be a higher risk than, for example, my event ending. And I put my logic in here. I was debating between a 1 or a 2 on this. The short term, there's probably not much difference. Long term, it's actually incredibly vulnerable, right? My population is depending on my soup kitchen for basic food needs. And so the vulnerability there, if I'm all of a sudden have to close up shop or I need to decrease what I'm giving out, are there really other places they can go get those resources, or are now they out of luck on that? And that's a really awful situation to be in. So I still put it as moderate, but not as high as somebody being sick and needing immediate medical attention. And again, these things, the population risk curve will automatically calculate for you. If you add in extra categories, if you wanted 4, for example, you need to change this equation. So you can always reach out to us, or you can get your nerd on and figure it out. It's just very, very basic still. Always good also just to put a last time you updated this, so that you always make sure you're dealing with the most current information. And if you're collaborating on this, other people can add information and update it. So you know, okay, here's what's moving forward. So that's the risk assessment. Then we want to move to mitigation planning. And this is, I'm going to zoom out just a little bit here. These automatically populated, right? This is exactly what I put in for my risk on the risk assessment tab. It carried over my organizational risk and my population risk scores. So now I can look at this and go, okay, I thought I had sort of a top 1 and then 2 that were tied for 2. But I can actually see, if I zoom out just a little bit more here, I can see, okay, this one this is going to be a higher priority for me right now. That score is a higher score than these other 2. And my top one around the infected individual is a higher net score than the third risk I put on this list of local gathering restrictions increase, and we're told we're no longer able to run our program on site. All 3 of these are going to feel urgent to you right now. All 3 of these are highly likely things that are going to happen. This helps give us a little bit of an order of operations of how to tackle them. Still, you want to go through and think through, like all the way through on each of these, of what it is you're thinking through. So the first one, what measures can we take now to minimize the likelihood of this event happening? If you think back to the risk score, that is the very first part of that calculation. What is the likelihood this happens? So if I can actually decrease or minimize that likelihood, it should then also lower my risk score, right? So it's a good way to start to mitigate how damaging something could actually be. And I've got really different things I can mitigate here. For an infected individual comes into my soup kitchen, I've got all these great ideas of what I can do, right? I can email my employees and volunteers to stay home if they're feeling unwell. I can develop screening protocols for clients and volunteers. I can train all my staff and volunteers around those screening protocols. I can install sanitizer stations. I can implement a really easy way to follow social distancing guidelines around 6 feet. Those are all things I can do right now to help mitigate how damaging something might be or how likely something would be to happen. For each of these, I've identified which person on my team is responsible for doing those. I've given a deadline of when I want that to be completed by. And as a work plan, I want people tracking what the status is. Has it started? Has it not yet started? Maybe, oh, actually, this one's already completed. Thank you, Sarah. You did a great job on this one. Let's keep moving through the rest of them. As you can see on the other 2 risks I identified, and this is maybe like, this is a good thing just to acknowledge. What chance do I have? What measures can I take to minimize the likelihood that I'm going to have to cancel my gala because local restrictions around gathering. I don't get any control over that. There's nothing I can do to mitigate the likelihood that the gathering restrictions are going to get extended or even increased. The mayor does not ask my opinion. The governor does not ask my opinion on these things. I don't have a way to like meaningfully influence these with my organization. These are things that are largely out of my control. The same with this piece around my program site being deemed you can't meet on site anymore. There's not a lot that I can do. In fact, I actually don't know if there's anything I can do to minimize the likelihood. But that doesn't mean that I'm not able to actually do something to help prepare for that type of crisis event should it occur. Again, the other benefit of having multiple people on the crisis response team thinking through this, I can't think of a way to minimize the likelihood, but maybe Sarah or Javier can, or maybe other people on my team can think of ways to think through, hey, what if we did X? What if we partnered with this organization and went to go lobby and made it very clear how vulnerable this population is for X, Y, and Z? Maybe isn't going to help with my gala, but maybe helps my on-site programming. So again, for each one, what is the specific task that I can do to minimize it? Who's responsible for it? When do they need to have it completed by? And what is the status so that it's a living and breathing document? Next, what measures can we take now to reduce the impact if it would have? Again, this is around this is part of the risk calculation. So how can I reduce the impact it might actually have? Well, if an infected person comes in, I've got two things I could do really quickly, right? I could establish referral pathways to health services that could support those potentially exposed staff or volunteers or individuals that are using my soup kitchen. And I can establish communication channels with key local authorities that would need to be notified, right? They can help us lock it down and minimize the actual impact it would have. Similar, I need to know who the person responsible is. I need to know when they need to complete it by and what's the status. Even though I didn't have anything I could do to mitigate the likelihood of my gala having to be canceled, there are things I can do to reduce the impact it would have on my organization. I could start cultivating donor relationships within the context of COVID-19 to try and diversify my donor portfolio so I'm less dependent on that gala for a fundraising source. I could launch an emergency funding campaign. I could preemptively freeze all non-critical expenditures so it's actually decreasing my expenses, meaning when I raise less money by having to cancel my gala, it's actually going to hurt less because my expenses have also gone down. I could also apply for one of the SBA loans that's through the CARES Act, the stimulus package. Maybe I can actually go get additional money to help make it so that, you know what, even though I lost that gala, here's a whole nother pot of money that I now have access to. I'm not feeling the pain or the impact of that gala getting canceled the way I would have if I didn't take these steps. Same thing, need to have a person responsible, when they want to have it completed by, and what the status is. Some things are actually just, and I wanted to highlight this, some things are just more nuanced than get it done by this certain date, and some things are just ongoing best practices. I should never be done cultivating donor relationships. That is a permanent thing that I should always be doing. There's not a milestone I hit where all of a sudden I say I'm done. But it is a specific concerted action I want to take, anticipating my gala potentially being canceled. All right, what measures can we take now to reduce the impact it would have on the populations we serve, right? So the last category was impact on my organization. This is about impact to the population I'm serving. So this is where you start to get into if an individual comes infected, all right, well, I can have a new sign-in and contact information protocols that allow us to track and notify anyone who came into the kitchen. Okay, so somebody, person A came in, we found out they were sick. I want to be able to let everybody else know who was potentially just exposed. I need to notify them. That can reduce the impact it's going to have on my population so that they don't all become mass spreaders as well. I can establish referral pathways for health services that can take exposed clients to go get healthcare that they need. As always, I need a point person for each of them. I need a date that it's got to be completed by, and I need the status update. Same thing down here with my gala being, my gala being canceled. Well, okay, maybe one thing I can do to decrease the impact it's going to have on my population. I was concerned that I maybe wouldn't be able to keep my security guards on staff at the level that I've had them on staff. All right, well, maybe I could start training volunteers on security protocols. So I've got more options for how we handle safety and security. Maybe I can start to increase social worker time now to help my population complete pending activities and programs, applications into new programs or new resources. Let's try to get it done now so that when we are then having, if it happens that my gala gets canceled, I'm not then scrambling to say, okay, I just lost 30% of my funding and now all my population is going to be behind on getting what they need. Let's step on the gas now and get them what they need as best we can, so that should this event actually perspire, that we are then good to go. Okay, the last stage of all of this is preparedness planning. Really, really, really important part of all of this. It's contingency plans and it's a preparedness plan that go hand in hand here. Contingency plan is, what do I want to do should that event actually come to be? And my preparedness plan is, what do I need to already have teed up, ready to go, should my contingency plan need to be activated? So you think of your preparedness plan as like the go bag that is already packed and waiting by the door. You don't take it with you everywhere. It's not like you constantly living out of your go bag. It's, should you need to leave really quickly, your go bag is already packed and you're out the door immediately into action mode. Not then having to go, okay, well, what do I need to go pack and what do I need to have ready to go? The simple version of all of this is when you're going on a road trip and you realize, oh, I didn't get the car tuned up, or I didn't get the gas filled up. And it's like, okay, you stall in your implementation of what you were trying to go do. You can do all of those things now, even without activating a contingency plan. So I want to think through that for each of my risks that I identified. So again, all of this self-populates from my very first tab. So I've got some sense as to what everything is. My first risk, an infected individual comes into my soup kitchen. What's my contingency plan if that happens? I thought of a couple of things here. One is I can notify people who might have been exposed. I can notify local authorities. I can shut down our in-person model and activate maybe a delivery-only one. And I can talk to partner agencies and identify where we can send clients. Hope alarms are going off. This is the coordinate part. How can I coordinate and coordinate and coordinate to help address maybe what needs to happen? Like everything, I need to know who's responsible for it. I need to know when it's going to happen. It's really hard for me to set a date because it's all based on when that activity happens. So some things need to happen immediately. Some things need to happen it's like top tier, second tier, third tier. There's lots of different ways to think through this. This one's a lot less rigid of this needs to get done. It's really just create an order of operations of what needs to happen first, second, third. You can see on the gala one, same thing. I've got a contingency plan. I need to cancel our venue reservation. I don't want to still be paying that hotel for all of that space if I can get out of it. I want to notify my sponsors and attendees, hey, don't go show up at that hotel in a tuxedo because that's not allowed anymore and we're not going to be there to host the event. I want to invite guests to a new virtual gala and I need to create a new run of show for that virtual gala, right? I'm going to totally switch gears here and I'm going to now take my in-person gala that just got canceled. And my contingency plan is I'm going to try to recoup what I can on my venue and I'm going to now move forward with a virtual gala. I need to know who's responsible for every piece and when they're going to happen. So here's one also that I actually have a date tied to this one because based on my contract with that place, I know if this has to get canceled by April 30th. Other things are maybe I'm basing it off of a previous action. So I need to notify people. Let's notify them within 7 days of when we cancel. And then my run of show, I really just need 20 days prior to when I'm going to have it, right? So some of these just need to be relative times. Okay, now what will trigger this action, right? How do I know, how will I know that it's time to activate that contingency plan? So for this first one, if I find out that an infected individual has come to the center, right? Pretty straightforward. The way that I know a contingency plan is needed is I'm actually seeing proof that, oh yeah, that thing I was really nervous about, it just happened. What do I need to track it? Well, I need to be getting some information from local health centers and services to ensure we're notified if they have suspected or confirmed case in one of our clients, right? My people that use my soup kitchen are going to lots of other places. I want to make sure that I'm hearing about it if one of them gets flagged as, hey, this is a high-risk person, this person likely got exposed. I need to know, okay, great, here's what's happened. Or this person is exposed and was just confirmed. Okay, that sets off my contingency plan on this. Different on this bottom one here is, as I'm thinking through what's going to trigger me knowing whether or not I have to cancel my gala, I need to be really up to date on the city, county, state, federal policies around shelter in place or restrictions around gathering. And so I want to just be in the news, right? I want to be following the news. I want to be reading reports. I want to make sure I'm on whatever listservs I want to make sure I'm getting the information in as timely as possible to know, oh, this just happened. Okay, it's time to, like, the extended period of shelter in place just carried through when my gala was going to be. Okay, now I know. That's triggered some event for me. Now, those are, I can't implement my contingency plan yet, right? It hasn't happened. The event hasn't occurred that has required me to go implement it. But I do need to make sure my go bag is packed and by the door and ready to roll, should I actually need to activate it. We've talked a lot in each of these webinars about how different the brain science is for people post-crisis as it was before crisis. Once you're in a crisis, the strategic thinking part of your brain is significantly less effective than it was prior. So that's the wrong time to start trying to get things in order. It's also, in case you haven't heard this from me and Marie enough, you have to move quickly in a crisis. So if you can tee up all of these pieces, when a crisis happens, you're going to be the first one out that gate able to respond and be more valuable to your organization, to the population you're serving, and to your community at large. So here are the specific things that I can go do to actually, like, take action on now to make sure my contingency plan is teed up and fully ready to go should I need to use it. For my first one, I already flagged this in the mitigation plan. Sarah on my team is developing and implementing a whole procedure around it. Fantastic. What's a reminder that she needs to get that done. Maybe I've got something. So this line is in touch with, I now need to go to a delivery service. Okay, well, I need to get packaging, right? Like, who am I going to use for packaging? I don't necessarily need to buy it yet. I don't want to invest too many resources. My budget's really strapped, but I do need to know, like, I can't just go, the trays that I've been using in my cafeteria, I can't just go drive those around town, right? I need some type of, like, plastic or something to be able to, like, put it in a safe way and hand them out. Well, who makes those? What do they cost? Can I negotiate on that at all? Are some of them better for my population than others? How long does it take to get those once I order them? How many can I order at a time? What do I think my order needs to be? Can I actually even design with them right now what I think my order wants to be? So if this happens, I can just hit, okay, activate it, go do it. Similarly, I need volunteers that are ready and willing with cars to go drive these things out. Or I need a partnership with DoorDash or somebody who can actually physically go take these meals around there. So do I know whether my volunteers have cars? Do I know which one of them have cars and are willing to drive for delivery? Do they have updated licenses? Do they have updated insurance? Those are not the questions I want to ask after a crisis when I'm thinking, oh, I should really switch to a delivery model. Oh yeah, do I even have access to cars? Is it legally okay for them to be driving those? Do I need a waiver from them? Do I even know where I'm driving these to? Right? Those are all pieces that I can figure out now. So that if I need to go that route, I can activate it quickly and I've got everything in place. I'm not going to walk through this again for the gala, but it's the exact same thing. What are all of the things that I can and need to do now so that should I have to activate a contingency plan, I'm ready to go and can go on the second that crisis hits. Again, we're trying to stop the need to have to do a lot of planning and organizing and logistics after a crisis hits. Everything you can do ahead of time so that it's ready to go, you want to do. And that's exactly what preparedness planning is. Okay, I'm going to switch back here to our slides. Again, I know this is very overwhelming for a lot of you, but I hope the tools that we're providing and the template we're providing give you the ability to go do this yourself. That is truly our goal on this, and wanting to make sure that people are operating with best practices in disaster cycle management and crisis response. If you need help, we are here. Just reach out. We are happy to help you think through these pieces, happy to help facilitate them for you, happy to help develop the risk monitoring system so that you understand and see when those triggers are actually hitting. I'm going to talk about soup kitchen examples. Okay, next steps and resources. So we've got all of our webinars are up on the website along with slides. We're going to post this one as well. We've got handouts and templates that are up on there. Please check them out. And just a note, this is the third of our 4-part series. The last one is on Monday at 12 Pacific on leadership and equity in uncertain times. And we're doing this with our partners at Moving Beyond, who I know you're going to absolutely love. They're amazing. They help operationalize diversity, equity, and inclusion to help drive long-term sustainable impact. They're amazing, amazing individuals, and excited to get to collaborate with them on this. And in case you haven't heard this from us enough, go to the website for more resources. Everything we've talked about here is there, along with a whole lot of other resources that you can have. If you see other things that you think we need added there, just let us know, and we'll keep building more and more resources for you. Marie, anything else you want to add before we, or Rebecca, anything else you want to add before we open up for questions?
No, that was great.
Wonderful. Don't know if we have any questions, Carly, but happy to spend some time answering them.
Yeah, we've got a couple that have come in already, and folks who are on the line, I invite you to keep on submitting them. But our first question, Jonathan and Marie, is about communication planning with regards to all of this crisis stuff. So do we have a template that connects crisis communication planning with these preparedness and contingency elements, but also more broadly, what can be pre-written, what channels are most effective in a crisis, and what do you want your messaging to convey to stakeholders that helps keep relationships intact?
I think on the first point for where it comes in with the templates, I think this should probably be a part of your contingency plan is as specific events happen, what are the communications channels you want to activate? What messages do you want to use? Calling those out and assigning specific people on your team to get that prepared and ready to go. And Jonathan, maybe you can talk a little bit more about how to approach communication effectively.
Yeah, so we don't have a template on the website for you of exactly how to go through this. But I do want to just highlight some of those things can be part of the preparedness plan, right? If you know that something's going to have to get sent out and how it gets worded and framed is really critical, you probably have more brain space to do that now than you do after that event happens. So some of these things, like, it's not a bad thing to have templates of some of this language already written, of here's what we're going to share out, and here's the group that we're going to share it out to, making sure you have all of the contact information and the right channels and listservs of who you're going to contact and about what. But the piece about working with your donors, your staff, your partners, I want to go back to some of the response planning session we did, which was the second webinar, which was really trying to push people to be to think like entrepreneurs. And a huge piece of that is about being one, acknowledging that you don't have all the perfect answers, and two is to be transparent and open. And what I have seen developing as the COVID-19 crisis has unfolded is the organizations with really transparent and just like an actual partnership relationship with funders are able to navigate this in a way that those that have a more transactional relationship aren't. If what you're used to doing is submitting a specific report and checking boxes, and that's the extent of it, this is probably not the right time to like dramatically change how you communicate. But as you think about preparedness planning and some of the mitigation pieces, building more of an actual partnership and relationship with those funders and letting them know what you're deciding and why, and getting their input on it, only is going to deepen their investment in what you're doing. There is nobody in the funding world that expects you to have all of the answers for how to navigate what's happening, because they also don't know how to navigate what's happening. And so pretending like you are perfectly organized and have everything in place, I think people are going to see through that really, really quickly. And actually owning, hey, this is our current best thinking. What other input do you have? How can you help us do this? This very much feels like an all hands on deck, which means I think being transparent on the communication front is really, really valuable, especially as you're trying to get better and better at how you respond to pieces. I think to Marie's point, I wouldn't be overly transparent in how you communicate around some of the contingency planning, simply because I think you'll create panic and confusion around what it actually is you do. If you start talking openly with your funders and your partners around contingency plans before that event has happened, they're confused as to whether you're already doing that or not. So that's probably a little bit more nuance that you have to do on a one-off basis for each partner.
Great. Thanks, Jonathan and Marie. We've got a question here from someone who maybe is an intern, but I think is also a little more broadly applicable. The question is, what back-end roles can interns contribute to right now if we aren't on the decision-making team? So maybe let's broaden that to interns and generally people who are not on that top-level decision-making team.
Yeah, I mean, I think that there's a lot that can be done in just supporting. There's a lot of pieces that we've talked through in all of these webinars, a lot of materials, a lot of resources. I think just reaching out to the decision makers on your team and figuring out what help they need to actually take all of this and put it into practice for themselves. Things like scheduling those meetings, things like looking at when people can convene, supporting to set up virtual meeting spaces, and going through those brainstorming tools we posted and figuring out how those are going to work in a virtual environment. Doing the note taking on all of these various templates and little pieces that we put together will definitely help people a lot to be able to just focus on having the conversations and engaging with one another to get through each of these steps. Any other ideas, Jonathan?
Yeah, I think and I'll sort of speak as an organizational leader here, and like thinking through how these things start to play out and where I see potential for things to slip through the cracks, where interns or frontline staff has a really valuable role to play. Obviously, we talked in the previous session about the external rapid needs assessment. So if you're an intern that's on the front lines, you might actually be really well positioned to be a huge asset in that effort. But for this work, as you think through like the preparedness planning, right, these are things that you want fully tied up and as close to go as possible. That last mile is the hardest and the one that's like, people can often identify, okay, here's the major thing that needs to happen. Here's the thing I need in place. But like, is it actually as cleanly labeled as it should be? Is it in the place that it should be so that when it comes time to needing it, it's logical and everybody can find it? Are you tracking sort of where all those things are? Are you helping be support to, even if you weren't the person in charge of getting it done, you can ideally see this of what's happening, or at least have some insight on it and reach out proactively and almost manage up on it. Hey, Sarah, I know that you were responsible for pulling the full list of all the contact information for all of our volunteers. Just want to check, is there anything I can do to help on that? Are there people that you want me to go track down because we have out-of-date information on it? So I think your own critical thinking and you just having a mindset of being of service is going to be a huge asset to the organizational leaders that you're working with.
I just add also on the steps we talked to you today, there was a lot of web research and basic desk research that I mentioned, looking at what resources are out there, what do experts and other people in the field think is coming next. That's a great place for you to jump in and be proactive and start putting together a lot of that information so that it's a bit more bite-sized and consumable in real time for decision makers on your team.
The last thing I'll actually add in here, because the only thing better than one answer to a question is now I think 4 answers to your question. It's a really good question. Is circling back to the stuff that Rebecca talked about earlier, about mindfulness and sort of the self-care and health. An intern often has a unique role of like, there's probably more personal relationships, or it's a more informal relationships, which often can lead to just being a better asset to the people around you and helping check in with them, and helping people process how they're feeling, not in a like professional mental health setting of like being a mental health professional on it, but just as a friend to a friend or as a colleague to a colleague. How are people doing? And just creating a space where people feel more comfortable to like take a moment for themselves, so they can be their full selves when they need to actually get to work on all of this important stuff.
Yeah, I'll also just add one other leadership dimension to this, because I think it's really a good question and brings up a lot. My husband often uses the term micro leadership to talk about small actions that accumulate and really create big change. And I think we're living in a time where you don't have to have the title to be the one to really create change. There's a lot happening and it's rapid, just as it's very clear in all of these webinars. So I think as much as we can all embody, whether you're, a senior leader or just getting started with your career, that these micro leadership sort of small steps or actions really make a big difference right now. So we should all be thinking that way.
Any last things to add to that answer?
I think we got that one. We got it.
Thank you all. We've got a couple more questions here, and I just want to invite folks once again to keep on submitting them if you've got other things you want to know. So one of them I'll take really quickly. Someone would like to know if the templates shown here today will be made available. Yes, they will. They will be posted on our website and we'll be emailing them out shortly.
Yeah. I just want to say
that
this is possibly the most useful template that we've put out so far. I strongly encourage you to take it and run with it. It's a very sort of formulaic process that builds on each step. And we encourage you to take that, contextualize it, adjust it as you need, reach out to us if you need any support with that. This is sort of a full package tool that should really help guide you through this process.
Thanks, Marie. Next up, we've got a question for Rebecca. If your staff is struggling psychologically, is it responsible for us as organizational leadership to rely on them during a crisis? Or alternatively, if I, as the leader of my organization, am struggling, what would you suggest to help? Should I put group meetings on the calendar? What do I do?
That is a great question. I'm sure Jonathan will have some thoughts on this question as well. So I'm not a mental health practitioner. I'm an executive coach, very different. So I am not at all trained to answer any questions relating to how to actually treat your staff around mental health. I think we all need time and space for this. And as leaders, we can do a lot to give our staff and teams permission to make the space for, online teletherapy, hiring an executive coach, working on these things in a one-on-one setting, which can be really helpful. We are not mental health practitioners, so we can't go to a staff member and tell them they need to do anything specifically, but we should be all making a very inclusive space for everyone to be able to access and make the time in their calendars, especially in these times, to be able to actually get the support and help that they need. So we should be modeling that as leaders and talking about it to our teams. Hey, I'm working with a therapist right now during these times and it's helping me, right? You can always model and share with your team and be vulnerable, which certainly gives people permission to do their own work as well. Jonathan may have thoughts as well on this on the HR front.
Yeah, shocker that I also have opinions and thoughts on this one. So I think this is a great question. And I think this is where there's a couple of things that become really valuable, and I'm going to answer this slightly differently. It's important to acknowledge that things have changed, right? If you're the way you operate and the way, what you expect and how you interact with your team members hasn't shifted in the last month, your staff is going to be super disengaged and you're not going to get anything valuable out of them, or very minimal. Owning the fact that, yeah, this is crazy. This is uncharted territory. This is scary. This is, I'm overwhelmed as an organization. Owning it and allowing yourself to be vulnerable and sharing that vulnerability with your staff, I think, is a really powerful piece. Nobody's immune to this crisis. Nobody's not feeling it. And so pretending like it's not there or pretending like it's not impacting people's work, I think is only going to set people up for failure and make people feel like they're under delivering. The other big piece that I think is critical is the culture piece that we talked about at a couple of different points in this series. One is leaning into your values. How do your values come alive in a moment like this? It's one thing of how your values manifest when you're giving a volunteer appreciation award. That's easy. But how your values manifest when you are up against the wall and in really scary, uncharted area, that's a much harder piece, but all the more important to lean into the organizational values you have. If those are not as codified as maybe they could be or should be, thinking about the second session and the pieces we talked about, the mentality around response planning, around thinking like an entrepreneur and being really transparent, you've got to give permission to the team to you know what, doing something is better than doing nothing. And we no longer sort of have that expectation that everything has to be absolutely perfect. It's an unreasonable expectation in a situation like this. We still want to hold each other to high standards and support each other to meet those. But when you start to build the culture of hey, yeah, things are different and we need to respond to this and acknowledge that we're not all operating on full cylinders right now, that gives the staff more space to kind of process what they're dealing with, find the outside help if they need professional help on it, but be a little bit more mindfully attentive to the work in front of them. On the personal side, because the other part of this question was as an organizational leader, if you're feeling like you're very overwhelmed by this, I really do think some of the stuff that Rebecca walked us through in the beginning and just being honest and checking in with yourself. Would you benefit from outside support, whether that's professional mental health support at a time like this, or whether it's something like executive coaching and helping you prioritize and stay focused and sort of find where it is you're of value in processing it. Both of those are really, really positive options. And even down to just taking some time for yourself. You have to live what you preach. You can't tell all your staff members to go for a walk and go listen to some good music and take some time for yourself if you're not doing that yourself. So you gotta live what you preach on that side.
And I think this is actually really important because it spans far beyond just this time of COVID, right? It's a very lonely position on the top. Executive leaders who we work with in our coaching practice every single day really don't have that many people to talk to. So we're already in that position all the time. And then we add this crisis on top of it. It really is a time to not go at this alone. And so I just encourage whatever support is needed, to just seek that out for yourself as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to echo everything that has just been said, and thank you for this question, because this is really the thought that was front of mind, and including all of that material that Rebecca talked through at the beginning of today's webinar instead of waiting until next week, is that this is really hard for leaders, and this is going to be really hard for your team too. And resilience is very personal, and it's a type of resilience you may not really know about the people on your team based on the type of work you've done before. Some people are going to be more or less up for this. Some people are going to be able to step into this role and really sort of stay calm and grounded and deal with that anxiety. And some people are going to struggle a lot more with that. So when you're putting together that team, when you're thinking through who needs to be involved, just not forcing anybody to take on a role that's too much for them. It's a very quick road to burnout, and not really an effective way to be moving through this process. So just using all those little pieces that Rebecca shared, those tools, and using those to create space for people to say what they're comfortable with and say what they're not, and help them actually stay calm and focus throughout these really difficult steps.
Great, thanks all. We've got a few more comments that have come in that I just want to share out. And of course, folks, if you have any more questions, feel free to throw them in the chat or the Q&A. One comment is someone who I think is very much looking on the bright side here. Wanted to just share, this is an exciting entrepreneurial opportunity. I think many great ideas will come out of this experience, and your webinar was like the starter for sourdough. So thank you for that. And we've got another suggestion from somebody saying, bring on board those who have experience in the armed forces. Those people will have training to deal with this and be more prepared.
Yeah, anybody on your team who has previous experience with this type of work, humanitarian response, armed forces, disaster response, natural disaster planning, there's a lot of disciplines and previous experience that can bring in a lot of the skills that are going to be really helpful at different stages of these steps.
Yeah, building up a tolerance to crisis is a really, really valuable asset. I mean, even like emergency room nurses and doctors that are maybe doing something else with their second career, insanely valuable to have on your team at times like this. If you happen to have volunteers that have that role or have that background, find them, tap into them, and bring them into these conversations, because my guess is they will help you bring a sense of calm to a very panicked situation. And to what the first comment was saying, like, help unlock where opportunity is, because the sooner you can get out of the feeling of being overwhelmed, the sooner you'll start to see some of that silver lining that Rebecca was talking about, and seeing opportunities for just a fundamentally better approach that we had to go through. We have to go through hell to get to it, and wish we could have thought about it before. But one of those silver linings of a crisis like this is that it's going to highlight amazing opportunity for us to go start to pursue.
Great, thanks, Jonathan and Marie. And the last comment, which was put in the chat, but I just want to make sure to share it out, is someone sharing that they've started blocking off time in their calendar for mental health breaks, taking runs, not looking at their computer, doing a mindfulness exercise, yoga, etc., whatever works for you. And it's helped this person really take a step back during the day each week, which has been really helpful for them. So they just wanted to share that out in case that is helpful for other folks.
Love that.
Yeah.
So, okay, so as we're, there are no other questions, correct, Carly, at this time?
Yep.
Okay, so I actually want to, I love that that first comment came out and talking about the opportunity here, because that's really where I want to end today's conversation, which is, we talked, the first two sessions were about living in the current crisis, and how do you respond to it, and how do you get yourself ready to be of service? And you're playing catch up, because none of us had COVID-19 on a potential risk assessment brainstorms before this, right? No one's like, oh, global pandemic, what's that going to do to my local soup kitchen? Like it's certainly, if you're based in America, that's like so far from the realm of what you thought was possible before this. But this really, like, as you start to get into mitigation and contingency and preparedness planning, you start to see, wow, you actually have a lot more agency in this than you maybe initially thought. In the example we talked through where I really had no ability to limit the likelihood that a certain risk maybe was going to take place, right? My gala is going to have to get canceled because I'm not legally allowed to have it anymore. I'm powerless in that situation, but I have so much power and so much agency if I think through, okay, but what else can I be doing to make that not actually, to make me care less that that's going to get canceled, have it impact me a lot less. And all of these things, if you start to implement them and start to think through them, are actually just best practices and things you should be doing in non-crisis times too. A lot of these are, because it just makes you a more resilient organization and makes you better equipped to weather whatever kind of curveballs are coming next, whether it's part of COVID-19 or whether it's some random thing that's going to happen in 2025. Like, it doesn't matter. It's about building organizational resiliency to get you ready as an organization to get through what you need to get through and always be of service, and constantly finding new and better ways to do this. The missing piece of this puzzle that we just touched on today is it's not enough to have organizational resiliency. You need leadership resiliency as well. And the session on Monday is going to really talk about how can we, as leaders of organizations or as leaders of programs or teams or efforts, whatever it might look like, how can we make sure that we are set up for success and mentally preparing ourselves to do what needs to happen while keeping equity front of mind? And not letting our own personal experience dictate the way that we see the world, letting it inform it, but really trying to think through how else can we be mindful of what's happening out there and make ourselves as strong and of service to our organization and our community as possible. So with that, thank you all very, very much. Please visit the website if you need any additional resources. We will continue to post all of this. We will email out specific resources on this as soon as we can. And we hope to see all of you again on Monday for the Leading in Equity in Uncertain Times. Thank you all very, very much, and have a great rest of your week.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.